Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us for yet another session of the SAIMM MTM collaboration on the webinars. Today, we are having the GCRF Mindless Network session, and we're privileged to have Professor May Hermanus speaking to us. She's going to speak to us on the topic of the Tshiamiso Trust, its origins, the mandate, uncertainties, ethical concerns, and food for thought, which is quite a lot. But I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I know quite a number of people who've already confirmed that they have been eagerly waiting for this presentation. So, but before we get into the presentation, just a brief of who Prof. May Hermanus is. She obtained a BSc in geology at UCT, so she's very much at home at UCT, MSc in physical metallurgy, and PhD from the University of Witwatersrand. She's a chemical Takemi Fellow of Harvard School of Public Health and works independently as a part-time academic, quite a number of roles, supervision, teaching, research, etc. She's also a board director and a consultant in a research and advisory capacity. Then she recently has been involved with the establishment of the Tshiamiso Trust and currently serves as the chairperson of the board. Now, this aligns quite well with her interests in mining, and these have been related to health and safety, the regulation of the sector, the structure and composition, both formal and informal, the positioning of the sector for inclusivity and sustainability, and transformation of the sector as well, so that one can account for the legitimate needs or interests of the full range of the actors and or stakeholders there. She also serves as the Avenge board, as the Avenge board as the lead independent director, and has held several other key leadership roles, mainly in the public and non-profit sectors. Professor May Hermanus, it's your time. I like the fact that you are May, short for your longer version of the name. And I was born in May. May, it's your time.
Oh, good. So is I, also born in May. So we have something in. Okay. So I'm going to start, and let me just check if everybody can see the screen. Can you confirm that, Cledman?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. So, so I'm speaking today as a WITS associate, but as you can hear from Cledman, I have quite a number of roles in this portfolio world in which I live and which many of you live as well. And that then just brings me to my next slide. And let me just see if I can move this on. You know, and I want to start with this remark that I am speaking in my personal capacity today and also as an associate of WITS. As I am the chair of the Tshiamiso Trust, and I've had various roles in the sector that relate to regulation in particular, and also to change in the sector, I have enormous difficulty in separating these roles. So you just have to bear with me, because I think that I've tried as an academic to just take a step back from the trust and look inwards, which of course isn't all that easy when you're directly involved. I'd like to start off by just reflecting on the trust's heritage, because it's not the first and it's probably not the last of trusts that arise from class action suits. And essentially, if one looks at the reasons why these have come into being, they come into play because of a failure in regulation and in policy. And I'm going to come back to that at the end of this presentation, because I think we still have a great deal of work to do. And I'm talking to the community of people interested in this subject and subjects related to mining and social justice. So the first of the trusts, I just have one slide on each of the previous trusts, and then more obviously on the Tshiamiso Trust and where it picks off. So let me start with the Asbestos Relief Trust. Now, one of the things that you might notice while I go through these slides is that different. It's not always easy to get equivalent information about all of these trusts from the information that I've been able to access, and I did try doing quite a hard search. And it appears to me that there really is a gap here in documenting and comparing the trusts and how some of the conditions have evolved over time. I certainly have a sense that when we look at the Tshiamiso Trust, that the culmination of the experience of all of these trusts has translated into a trust deed that's incredibly complex and incredibly hard to navigate. But you might have other views. So let me just start with the Asbestos Relief Trust, which is now 25 years old. And it started off with 401 million in the bank available for both the payment of claimants and also to run the trust. And it still has 240 million rand available, having paid out 394 million rand, which is a lot in this period. It's a 25-year period. Now, and to date, 4,600 claimants have it as at February 2020. Now, I want you to bear those figures in mind when you look at what's required of the Tshiamiso Trust. Now, in this case too, the origins obviously are in a lawsuit with legal proceedings that started in 2001 and an agreement was reached in 2003. Now, this for me is quite remarkable when I look at this figure now, that it took 2 years to reach a settlement in this case. And it might certainly have been that at the time there were huge concerns across the globe about asbestos and the impacts of asbestos, not only in the working environment, but also in the public environment. I've listed the companies who are party to this trust now, and many of them are no longer companies that we would recognize: Gencor, Masauli, African Chrysotol, Asbestos, and Hanover Mining Holdings. The litigants you will see in these trusts have, particularly from the point of view of the claimants, has been interesting, because obviously it's been Richard Spoor who has played an instrumental role in virtually all of the trusts, bar one. And at the time he was with Naturi, Noble and Spoor. And the initial litigation was brought against Crickland Exploration and Finance Company, Jeffco. Now, the purpose of this trust, which is similar to the other trusts, bar one thing, that it was both looking at claimants who had worked at the companies or who were environmentally exposed to asbestos from the operations of the companies, which is not something that you would see in the trusts that follow. And obviously associated with that work had to be exposure to asbestos, which was taken as given, and also the consequence of asbestos-related disease. Dependents could also claim in terms of that trust, but they needed to be able to show that whoever the original claimant had in fact, or rather the person concerned had in fact worked or been exposed, and there was evidence of asbestos disease. Now, I'm going to keep coming back to the issue of evidence of disease, because that can be a significant problem, as you will see it is in the Tshiamiso Trust. Now then, another trust that comes into play literally 5 years later is the Kgalagadi Trust, which is also concerned with asbestos, and that settlement date was reached in 2006, and it has to do with the exposure to Cape Blue asbestos. Blue asbestos, as those of you who are in the know, is the more virulent form form of asbestos. And again, it had the same, very similar conditions to the Kgalagadi Trust, and in fact, the two trusts are now very closely related, and they work out of the same environment. Then just 5 years ago, we had another trust come into play, and that's the Quebec Trust. And my colleague on the trust, the Tshiamiso Trust, Dr. Sophie Kisting, is the chair of the Quebec Trust, which is still in operation and in the process of winding down. So in this case, it was an unusual situation where there were 4,365 named miners, ex-miners, that this particular trust considered, that were subject to the trust. Of those, the Quebec Trust has examined, at the time that I looked up the data, was 3,858 individuals. And of these, 2,433 were diagnosed with a silica-related disease. Now,
excuse me, mate. Sorry.
Yes.
I think your slides are not moving. Sorry.
Okay, all right. My apologies. So
Thank
there's the Khalkhari Trust, and I'm happy to share these slides if anyone would like to have them afterwards. And I'm not dealing with the Quebec Trust. So the situation with the Quebec Trust is that there were a number of those named miners who turned out to be ineligible. So they weren't able to be paid out under this trust. So that is quite a significant number given over a course who were named in the claims in the trust's litigation. And to date, it has paid out 282 million rand to 2,500 claimants. I also want you to think about, as we go through this, to look at and divide the number of claimants by the amount of money that has been paid out, and you'll start to get a sense of just how much these claims are worth. It's a big issue in the Tshiamiso Trust. The settlement date here was 2016, which, as you can see, was not long before the Tshiamiso Trust settlement was reached. And the companies involved here are Anglo American South Africa and Anglo Gold Ashanti. And in this case, the claimant's attorney was Richard Meeran from Leyday & Co., whom we know has a track record in looking at issues around occupational health in various settings around the world, and who have launched a number of lawsuits in favor, or rather on the basis of the claimants' cases. And in here, in the Quebec Trust as well, the payments were made to claimants on the basis of identifying silica-related disease. And there were conditions set out in the Quebec Trust deed on what those might be. And now when we come to the next trust, which is the trust we're talking about today, the Tshiamiso Trust, of course, it's the absolute newest, and it was registered on the 1st of October 2019, and the full board, which includes myself, I was appointed on the 6th of February, not in 2019, but in 2020. So that is a mistake, which I will correct. And it's important, one, partly because if one looks at the longevity of this trust, the work started quite a long time ago in the early 2000s on trying to get this trust to the point where there was a settlement. So the claimants have been waiting a very, very long time for some relief. Key things about the trust, the companies have earmarked 5 billion rand. They're not in the trust's accounts, by the way, and that's an important thing because there are many claimants and others who believe that the trust has control over a bank account of that size, which we don't. In fact, the money comes into the trust as the claims get paid. We do have 800 million available for administration, and believe it or not, we're already starting to see I have some concerns about whether that administrative budget is going to be adequate. Now, as at the 1st of September, which was just a few weeks ago, we had registered 91,738 claimants. Those registrations have translated into 47,530 lodgements, and to date, we have, in fact, as I sit here today, made 300 payments. And I want to explain that more. That really goes to the issues of complexity. Now, if we look at the parties to this trust, there are 82 mines involved, and they come from a number of mining companies which are listed here. Anglo American, African Rainbow Minerals, Anglo Gold Ashanti, Goldfields, Sibanye Stillwater, and of course, again, representing the claimants is Richard Spoor, and this time joined by Charles Abrams, and of course the Legal Resources Centre, and a couple of other, and also attorneys from Motley Rice LLC and Housefield LLP. And in this trust, there were 4,000 named claimants. So we have the names, and we have a bit of data about these 4,000 claimants whose claims we have tried to prioritize. Now, the purpose of this trust is to compensate claimants who were employed between 1965 and the 10th of December 2019. Now, those of you who have a long history with this sector or knowledge or insight into the sector know that in 1965, we were still very much under the whip of apartheid, and documentation, particularly of miners, and in fact everyone who fell outside of the privileged groups under apartheid, really had huge problems in terms of their documentation, including their identity documents, and their dates of birth, etc. So in addition, we also have a situation where there's no digitization of data in the sector until the 1980s, when Anglo American started digitizing information, and that process was quite uneven. So there's a time limit here, 12 March 1965 to 10th December 2018, and the trust is looking at compensating miners and ex-miners who contracted silicosis and TB in the course of their work. And there are many, many conditions in the trust deed, some of which I will share with you. If I carry on, these are some of the commonalities between the trusts, as far as I can see, in my very brief review of them all, was that in all cases, there are very specific medical conditions mentioned, and often there are criteria for how one ensures that those conditions are met. There's a requirement for proof of exposure, and that's done through employment, i.e. qualifying service, or residency, which is obviously in the asbestos-related areas in the case of the Asbestos Relief Trust and the Kalahari Trust. Beyond that, there is the need for the proof of status as a dependent, which I don't have to explain to you that in South Africa, this is a very difficult issue, especially when you're dealing with a population of migrant workers whose families are often divided between a rural area and an urban area. And there might be situations as well where multiple spouses are involved. The proof of disease goes to some very complex medical processes, and I think those of you who are medical specialists will recognize the demands and complexity of this kind of these proofs. One is X-rays, which can be interpreted differently by different medical providers, lung function tests, biopsies, autopsies, etc. And obviously for individuals who have passed on, and dependents of individuals who have passed on, autopsy data becomes absolutely critical, and there's paucity in that space. And that's something that applies to all of the trusts. Then there are differentiated awards based on assessment of the severity of the disease. Now, for me, this is something that is particularly concerning because, in my experience, people who have done hard work all of their lives, and that doesn't only include miners, that includes agricultural workers, forestry workers, fishermen, and so on, that many of them, by the time they reach the end of their working lives, they're quite debilitated. They're physically quite their physical health has really diminished, but it may not be attributable to an occupational disease. And that's the point, and that's one of the conundrums that all of these trusts are faced with. Now, the other matter in differentiated awards is not only just the assessment of the severity of the disease, but also the differentiation that then follows. And then it makes it very difficult for individuals to work out what they ought to expect as a payment from these trusts. And for the Tshiamiso Trust, you will see that this is a particular problem, and the issue of dealing with expectations is extremely significant. So the reductions in awards often relate to earlier claims that have already been settled, such as claims with the MBOD, for example, or non-qualifying service at mines that are not party to these trusts. And this obviously can have a very significant impact on whether a claimant is actually able to access a claim or have a successful claim at all. And then we have and as a consequence, we have a very significant number of rejected claims. Now, I want to just pause here for a bit, because one of my early experiences with the Tshiamiso Trust was that we were very grateful to be housed initially, when we were starting to think about how on earth we were going to set up the systems to support the Tshiamiso Trust at the Quebec Trust's offices. And on several mornings and several days when I left those offices, I found outside the trust a very large number of people who had traveled all the way from the Northern Cape to those offices, who were upset and angry and distressed, and also in despair that they had not received any payments. And they'd come to those offices to demand that they get justice and that payments be made. And that for me was a real eye-opener, and perhaps a harbinger of what is likely to come in the trust, in the Tshiamiso Trust, if we do not think very carefully about how we navigate these issues. Now, before I go to the challenges in the trust operations, and I'm mindful of the time, I just want to point out a couple of underlying issues which I think really need attention, and many of you who are online may actually be in the position to do something about these things. So the first is about the failure to protect miners at work. Obviously, the reason why these trusts come into being is because there's been a failure in controls at work, and they have to do with the way equipment is designed, the environmental controls, and also where these are not sufficient, also the effectiveness of personal protection, and there are many categories of that, as you will be aware. Then, of course, we have the very large backdrop, which still looms over us, of an unjust compensation system, where miners with occupational disease receive very much more inferior compensation from others who are compensated under the COID Act. So we have a very long history of discrimination here, and certainly in the not too recent past, we've had a situation where Black workers particularly were discriminated against in terms of even the limited compensation available under ODIMWA. Along with that, given the neglect of migrant workers and their circumstances in their communities, these workers have had very limited access to diagnostic services and treatment facilities. As you know, for occupational disease in the country is very scarce, and for people who come from outside of the country, even less likely to be available. So we have a situation where we are looking at the backdrop of a failed compensation system. There is remediation in progress, but as far as I understand, within the Department of Health and the responsible institutions, there's still years and years of a backlog of unassessed claims. It's been largely based on the handling of paper. Many documents have been lost in that process, and also this has given rise to a very easy situation in which to commit fraud. So even in the trust, where we depend on information from the MBOD and from the CCOD, we have to be very careful that we also don't fall foul or fall victim of the same frauds that were committed, because they are around documentation, the altering of documentation, the duplication of documentation, etc. So we have put in systems, and we'll continue to be looking at the issue of fraud. But that doesn't, I think, take away from the fact that the failures in the compensation are a really big overlay. Then, of course, we come to the issues that I think all of us who work into the occupational health area and who work in mining are particularly attuned to. The fact that we are dealing with systematic injustice and inequality, and the mining sector has been at the heart of this and has a very long history. So it still bears the scars, as well as the responsibilities that come with that history. And many of these issues still remain to be resolved. So one of those issues are obviously the migrant labor system itself, the whole concept of racial capitalism, where one bases the exploitation of labor also on a labor hierarchy. And lastly, just the marginalization of most South Africans, and particularly mining communities, from the services that one would ordinarily expect in a functioning democratic society. So then, just to move on to the trust itself. Perhaps just a comment before I do. So all of those underlying problems come home to roost in the work of a trust, not only in the Tshiamiso Trust, but they come home to roost in every other trust that has been in operation. And I think for me, certainly there has to be a shift in that understanding generally in the community that operates around the trust about where those responsibilities lie and how they are addressed. So let's go to the trust operations. For me, the first few touch points are just the sheer scale of the Tshiamiso Trust, the reach that it's expected to have, which ties in with the problems around administration, the complexity of this trust with all its conditions and all of the steps that need to be followed in order to get to the point where you can actually pay somebody, and then the number of people ultimately involved in the trust's work. The trust itself might have a handful of employees, actually it's far more than a handful at the moment, but we rely very heavily on a range of service providers to do the outreach work, to run the offices where lodgements take place, to provide the medical services and so on. And so we have a very big footprint, and I haven't yet counted how many people are actually involved in trust work and will do so, because obviously we have to ensure that everybody involved with the trust is respectful and lives up to the trust values, and the service that we deliver is consistent. So there's a huge managerial aspect to the trust's work that mimics that of large organizations. So let's just look at some of the issues around scale and complexity. The first is that there are about, and this is my estimate, that in the gold mining sector, about 1.3 million people ever worked in the gold mining sector. And if we look at the companies who are involved in this trust deed, we are dealing with about half of those individuals who could expect or might expect to be compensated in this trust. And where are they from? They're from South Africa. They're from the various provinces in South Africa where mining has been concentrated, from Lesotho, from Mozambique, from Swaziland, and potentially even further afield, because we know that there are miners who are possibly also eligible, who might be in Mozambique, in Namibia, and elsewhere. The migrant labour system has been very, very extensive. Also, the other aspect of this trust deed is that there are 10 classes of claims. Now, I've actually put the claimants' classes on the next slide, not to go through them one by one, to just give you an idea what they involved, how they are described. So if we look at these claims, there are four classes. There are 4 applicable to silicosis, 3 applicable to TB, and 2 applicable to the dependence of silicosis claimants, and 1 associated with the dependence of TB claimants. And this is all based on the availability of medical information, which results in severity, decisions about severity of disease, employment history, etc., exposure, and then proof, all sorts of proof that all of these aspects of the claim can in fact be verified in some way or the other. So in addition to that, we find ourselves working with 6 working languages: Portuguese, Sesotho and Sotho, Tswana, Xhosa, Zulu, and English. Now, you can imagine the difficulty that we have in trying to make sure that when we are engaging a particular claimant, from the very first call onwards, that we can explain adequately and thoroughly and clearly to someone and hear what they have to say, their concerns very clearly. So that's a big challenge for the trust, and obviously we've had to make use again of service providers to help us with ensuring that we can do this level and scale of communication. So so here is the claimant list. You'll find this in the trust deed, and I'm just going to give you an example of one of them. This is the one second from the bottom, just to give you an idea of what sort of things one needs to consider. So this is now historical tuberculosis in the absence of a medical report determining the degree of silicosis. An eligible claimant must have worked at one of the mines for 2 years between the 2 dates. They have been issued a tuberculosis certificate, which hasn't got indicated a degree of silicosis. They must have worked within a year. That certificate must have been issued within a year of working at least 1 shift at one of the mines. And then over and above that, they may have also got a proof of a first-degree silicosis or second-degree silicosis. So you can see that there are many aspects to the process of simply just becoming an eligible claimant. Now let's just look at the outline of the claims process, and this is literally where we start running down the clock in this presentation. So in terms of for the trust itself, we've realized that if we are going to rely on trying to find every potential claimant who's likely to be successful, we would really be here for a century. So essentially what we're needing to do is to enable claimants to find us. And we've tried to set up a network that relies on several platforms: phone, direct. We're walking into offices that miners are used to walking into, and new ones where they can check their availability. Having the data to hand, so we wanted right from the start to make sure that we had a database that allows us to tell someone at the first instance, yes, we have data and it indicates that you're in, or no, we don't have enough data and this is what's missing. That is still a work in progress, but we've come a long way from where we started. People obviously need to be able to book an appointment and book that appointment at a location that is best for them. And in certain cases, we know that we have to go out to reach claimants that are hard to reach, that are particularly ill and particularly elderly. There's a necessity to gather necessary documents by both the claimant and the trust. We also know, given the long history of mining and the age of many of our claimants, that many of these documents are probably lost. So there's a real sense here that we have to gather these documents wherever they might be, and that includes mining houses. We need to organize medical benefit examinations. Now, these are dependent on the availability of very few experts. I'm certainly very concerned that we are drawing expertise from other parts of the health sector, particularly in the face of the pandemic. So we need to be as efficient and ensure that when we do need medical benefit examinations, that they are conclusive at the very first round. Medical certification follows medical benefit examinations. Then we've got to review the claims in light of all the data that's required and certify it as a trust. Now, we're not the last word in certification. It has to go to the agent of the founding companies to confirm that we've met all the requirements. And what we've discovered in this process, which is why that payment clock is ticking over so slowly at present, is that there are many ways to interpret the conditions of the trust deed. And so we found ourselves having to clarify with the agents, now both agents, the claimant's agent and the agent of the companies, as to what the trust deed means in respect of a particular condition. And this is obviously a painstaking process. And so far, every claim that we've touched has thrown up something new. Hopefully we believe that we've reached most of the areas where there might be some cause for concern, but we are hopefully very close to closing all of these out, which would then mean that the claims can flow far more swiftly, and we would have little opportunity. We will have very little cause to hold back claimants and defer and do some more investigation, more talking, etc., to reach conclusion. Then we go on to the fact that we really need to make sure that claimants themselves can see where we are in the process. Now, we have got platforms for that, but it's very clear that not everybody can reach them. And when people reach them, they're not necessarily able to understand the feedback that's been given. So there's work for us to do in the communications area. We then have to go to approval of payment, and around that, we need to make sure that we have the right identity of person, we have a unique bank account, that the money actually gets paid, that the claimant also receives financial literacy advice or other financial advice if they need it. So again, there's another loop to be followed there before money actually lands in the claimant's pocket. Now, here's just some of the uncertainties in this. These are all data uncertainties, and they relate to the availability of ID documents, employment records, medical records, the availability of expertise, the problem of fraud, which I must admit I've been amazed at how fraudsters are able to find novel ways of penetrating systems. So far, so good. We're holding up. And then, also the uncertainty about the validity of claims and the very long waits for decisions. Because when we do have uncertainty, we've got to try and create as much certainty as possible, make sure that they can pass the various tests, and then we need to ensure that the agents that sign off are happy with the conclusions that we've drawn. So for me personally, I'm very concerned about how and who will ultimately be awarded, given the enormous set of expectations out there. So we've by ourselves produced or asked for an actuarial report to be produced for the trust, so that we can have some indication of how many people we're likely to compensate. Also, if you do some rough calculations on the amount of money made available, you can also reach your own conclusions that way. And of course, there are epidemiological studies, which the outcomes of which can vary very significantly. So we know that many people are going to be disappointed, and I'm very worried that more people will be disappointed than we had anticipated. So this just gives you an idea of the systems that have been put in place, and I'm literally going to flash these in front of you. So we have a trust deed, the trust deed or trust, and on the trust deed, or rather the a trust website, and on that website you will find this dashboard, and you can find it in a truncated form and also in its full form, where we give data on every step in the process. Now, we have counted 8 steps in the process, and internally that, as you can see along the line at the top, translates into about 15 points where we have to stop and assess and see if we can move on, and so forth. You can also see from this that to date we've made contact with 26,000 people, and we have registered over 92,000 claimants, and we have appointments for 54,000. So you can see the numbers are significant. The numbers are also broken down by region, and they're also broken down by the various service providers that we are using in the provision of the various services. And here they are. So we have some idea of, the lodgement processes and the BME performance running through the TEBA offices, through Netcare offices, through Wits Health Consortium, and then we have a total. We obviously are concerned about having too many service providers, because the process will become horrendously unmanageable, because these are many sites in any case, and we also have to look at quality across all of these sites. But you will see that the sites that are at the moment processing most of the claims or to date are TEBA, which is quite an irony given TEBA's history and its past history. But it's clearly a place where miners come to get certain questions answered, to get various information. So it makes sense for the trust. And we obviously have set up standards across all of these points. Now, this just gives you an idea of the actual point of payment, what we have to do at that point, because it often feels like when we have certified a claim for payment that we're at the end of the process, but we're not. We have to obviously verify banking details, and there are various ways of doing that. We need to do a tax review, because SARS wants to claim any tax that's outstanding. So we have to do a tax review. An interesting thing for migrant workers, and particularly migrant workers that go way back when. Then we also need to make sure that we've done provided the adequate financial advice, and then last and not least, we have to pay the claim. Before I close off, I want to just flag a couple of things which I'm hoping will lead into the discussion. That for me, the occupational disease data that we currently have is a real worry. It often simply just gives incidence data. It doesn't give you a sense of whether disease is progressing, what prevalence rates look like at the moment, and the extent to which these conditions are still being are still affecting the industry and affecting obviously the miners who work in this industry. Now, last but not least for me, the lawsuits and the trusts that come out of them are really a response to real failures in policy, regulation, and compensation regimes. Now, these rely on individuals, case-by-case adjudication, and they do not bring justice to the population of people affected. Ultimately, they can't lead to rational and consistent policy. It's a wrangling process, and the claimants' representatives and the company representatives do the best they can to find a middle ground, but obviously there are various interests that come into play. And last but not least, these trusts, as you will have seen, and the concerns that I've already raised, are very hard pressed to deliver a timely and comprehensive remedy to the problems that I've outlined. So yes, I'm food for thought, and I really hope that the bigger community can assist us with this. We must address the data gaps. I think that some of them, personally, I think that some of the ESG funds that companies are that are advertising very widely must go into this particular problem of addressing gaps in data for people who have worked in this industry and sacrificed their lives and health. We've got to expand diagnostic capability, and how do we expand that? Is there technology out there? Can we harness technologies that make it easier for individuals who are responsible for providing diagnostic services? How do we reduce the wait? And are there other means of redress? So that's me. I'm sorry I've run 5 minutes over time. I was hoping that I wouldn't, but I'm happy to take questions or perhaps just hear your reflections.
Thank you very much, May. A very interesting presentation, and I trust that we're all glued. I will ask those that want to raise their hands for questions to do so, but in the meantime, I'll start with the ones that are in the chat. The hands are already coming up. It says, hi May, thank you for joining us on your presentation so far. What were the main reasons given for the 1,425 non-eligible claims for the Quebec Trust?
I'm afraid I haven't delved into that very closely, but most of these claims fail on the basis of proving disease that is compensable in terms of the trust conditions, and they also fail in proving employment, which would not be an issue in the Quebec Trust, given that these were all named employees from the company concerned. So it's probably around uncertainties around disease.
Okay, uncertainty around disease. So maybe that's another data gap that needs to be closed. Okay, the next one is
I think also it goes to my point, Cledwin, about the fact that many people are ill when they exit this industry. But their illness is not necessarily compensable. There is a very big gap between being ill and being ill from the point of view of being able to be compensated. And for me, that is a huge, huge problem.
Okay, thank you. AJ, your hand is already up. I'll ask you to ask your question and maybe combine it.
Thanks very much indeed. That was a very interesting talk. With all these things, the amount of overheads, etc., is a problem. And I just wonder why it's not funded in a separate way, because if you take it's 5 billion rand, probably at least 1 billion is going to be in overheads, which I understand. There's incredible complexity, but the math of the remaining 4 billion and the 650,000 people who may be eligible doesn't seem to work out. And I just wonder what work was done between some sort of a risk assessment into a variogram of who's going to be claiming and whether the money's enough, because the worst situation is going to be that people who really do deserve compensation don't get it because there's no funds left in the trust. And I just wonder what can be done to try and address that issue.
Thanks very much, Sam. I actually think that perhaps I haven't explained this adequately. So the indicative sum is 5 billion for the full operation of the trust, which includes the 800 million which is set aside for administration. However, the amount that can be paid out is not capped. Clearly the companies did whatever homework they did in the background to determine how much they expect to pay out and how much they expect the administrative costs to be. So that's how that sum is arrived at. For me, where I sit at the moment, I think that the administrative costs have been hopelessly underestimated. So we have fixed capped administrative cost, and judging by the amount of work that we've had to do just to get the system into place and all of the elements of it that are required, and the scaling up that we've had to do to try and accommodate all of the claimants, for me, there's some uncertainties that vest around that. So we are really having to look now from a managerial point of view, how do we work more efficiently and more effectively?
Thank you, May. Mohammed, you may ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, May. Nice seeing you and hearing you after many years.
Yeah, that's right.
So my question is, May, in relation to the certification. you, at the outset, when you painted the picture around these trusts and the level of acceptance of claims, they have not translated into the kind of expectation that all of us who have been advocating for redress and adequate compensation and justice in relation to previous exposures. And so the question for the Tshiamiso Trust then is, you said there are two phases within where the claims are preliminary certified, and then, if I understand correctly, it goes to the agent, and the agent then perhaps has the final say in terms of certification. So my question is, what is the level of preliminary certification and final certification among those for whom the claims have been lodged? What percentage is that? Thank you.
Okay, so I've just put this slide up again, and I hope you can see it. And I want to just show you what you can see across that slide. Is you'll see the drop off as we go from one phase to the next, a very direct drop off at between completed lodgements and completed BME. Some of them have to do with just the time that it takes. But it's at the lodgement phase where, you know, the employment records are considered, and at the point where you come out of the medical certifications where the largest drop-offs happen. When we come to the end of the spectrum where the agents have to review, now remember, we're working on a system that we have computerized. So essentially behind us, all the decision-making is going to be sitting in that system. At the moment, given that we're processing the first claims, we are finding all of the potential for different interpretations of the trust deed, and that then goes into another process of deliberation between the claimants' agents, own legal advisors, because we have a medical advisory panel and other panels as well to advise us. So we expected at that end, at the end point, we will find out that we will probably clarify most of the differences, and when they come out in future, they're likely to be very few and far between. But it's the other areas that create the problems: the absence of missing data, the absence of medical records, the autopsy data, and so on, that really create problems for claimants. And then, of course, findings that ultimately don't show that the level of debilitation of disease is not compensable.
So, Gladwin, through you, so what percentage? Yes, so what percentage are accepted at the end of the day among those who have been evaluated? Is it 30%? Is it, what is the percentage?
So quite frankly, we don't know. We have too little data to know. We have too little data to know. The only that's why we have essentially asked and proceeded to get some work done on actuarial assessments, so that we can start to get a picture of what that endpoint's going to be like. I mean, I've certainly done my own little mathematics on what would 420 million divided by an average of 100,000 or 70,000 look like in terms of numbers of claims, because that must have been the kind of numbers that the companies might have had in mind. And that figure is horrifyingly small already. So we will publish our actuarial findings, and we will be open, of course, to any kind of remedy, but that remedy has to be in the real time, in the space where we actually understand the claims process, and also are able to let and communicate with people about the possibility of a claim being successful or not.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, May, for answering that question. Is there anyone else who has another question? The ones that in the chat is in agreement that Sam is acknowledging that it's very complex. Jim.
Hello. Hello,
Go
May.
ahead.
Thank you for the talk.
Are there?
I'd like to know, sorry, I don't have a light on me. I'd like to know why the trust is compensating people only at a level of silicosis 1-1. The international definition is 1-0.
Conditions of the trust deed. So yes, I mean that's another debate. As you are probably aware, if you look at the conditions of all of the trusts, the criteria that are applicable are fixed in the trust deed, and that's probably got to do with how the settlement sum was arrived at, and certainly it's a problem that we've raised. But it's really up to the claimants. The trust itself cannot change the trust deed, so these issues have to go back to the claimants to have a look at. But it's very clear to us from the responses that we have that these conditions are fixed, and they were fixed at the time of negotiation.
Thank you, Jim. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question of everyone around the table? I've put it to you that I think that for many of the mining companies who are involved in the trust deed, it would really help if they were to find the data that they have in paper and digitize it and make it available to the trust, that they make occupational health records available, that those records that have been compiled at mine sites, it would certainly be a help, and also that that they themselves play a role in locating potential claimants to the trust. To me, those look like typical issues that you should have in your ESG programs. Can I hear from anyone as to why that isn't the case, or why they believe it oughtn't to be the case?
Thank you, May, for fielding that question at the audience. Any takers? Shahida, Mohammed?
Okay, I see Shahida's question. So we are finding that in the Western Cape, for example, many of the people whose claims we have looked at thus far are actually not gold miners. They're platinum miners. And I'm not really sure what the situation is in Mpumalanga, but we can certainly ask. But you can also see from the response that I've given you that there are many miners who believe that they are eligible, and are still the message that this is about gold mining, and then only a specific group of gold miners who are eligible in respect of this trust hasn't really gotten through to everyone.
No.
Can I just say something? I would also, sorry, I don't know where my hand is. I can't seem to find it. That's why I can't put my hand up. So I just, I think that with the Tshiamiso Trust, we've also noticed at my clinic younger miners coming, and I do wonder about the information and awareness campaign that is being run and whether it is reaching eligible claimants. That is the one thing. The other issues, and I do understand the value of a rapidly screening program that can do high volumes in a short space of time, which is why you've gone for specific service providers, maybe with a network of facilities across the country. But certainly in the Western Cape, I can say to you, Tableview is very far away from Langa and Khayelitsha, which is where a lot of our mine workers come from. And I'm not sure that was taken into consideration. And then just to your first question, we are a very small operation at the clinic. We certainly try and alert our claimants who come for MBOD and BMEs that they may be eligible for this. Many of them know about it, and we try and check on your system. But obviously, I do agree there's a need to engage with mining houses so that that sort of information actually gets turned over or gets made accessible to people such as the trust? And also, what about all this new and ongoing MBOD claims? Are you not having access? Because many of those claimants may actually qualify.
That's right. So we do have access to let me start with the last one, Shahida. We do have access to the MBOD data, and essentially our information crosses between the organizations all of the time. So we're not short of that. Then in terms of table view, what we've discovered in the Western Cape is that the taxi routes and bus routes and so on are not necessarily all that dense as they might be in, for example, in a place like Gauteng. And that table view is interestingly enough accessible via taxi, but with something that we've ourselves have asked whether that's within the trust, whether that's the most appropriate location. So we will obviously turn to review that and would value some advice. Then on the numbers of people turning out, for me, I have a sense that we have two factors at work. One is that that certainly many people have received information about the trust. Whether that information is understood, given all of the complexities that I've explained on this particular call itself, whether those actually land somewhere is another story. And secondly, we know that there are many people who are desperate anyway, who are trying to see whether they, for some way or other, can't be eligible. So we're expecting people to try anyway, and we're expecting quite a lot of misunderstanding in the complexity of the data. And yes, I think that's a very good comment from Aisha Latta, that I do think that there's a lot of room for more help around making sure that we can reach everyone with the appropriate messages and explanation of this deed.
Thank you. Mohammed, you wanted to take a shot at the question that May had posed to us.
Okay. I'm going to probably give a very controversial response. And well, firstly, to say I agree with you. But the caveat is this, or this is the controversial part, or perhaps not controversial. The issue is, one could argue that given the rate of acceptance of claims in relation to the expectation that has been out there around the eligibility to apply for claims, that this is all a process to make it as complex and complicated as possible, so as to minimize or to reduce the number of claims to as far as possible. And so this is purely a frustrating process for a potential claimant to go through these 10 to 12 steps, and at the end of that entire period to be rejected. And I say this because your claimants who are going to be resolved and who get awarded are your ambassadors going forward. If one does not deal with this issue in terms of this complicated process, and at the end of all of this, people get nothing, then one would argue, are we doing more harm than good? Are we creating an expectation that here you are eligible, but you go through this entire process, create all this anxiety amongst potential claimants and their families, and get nothing? And then I want to finally end and say, was that the design of the mining industry, that it engaged in this process to get this trust going, to make it so complicated, to frustrate the claimants, and to wash its hands off it, so that people like you and the good-hearted people who are now running this trust have to deal with all the potential problems that have been encountered in relation to that. So perhaps my answer to you then, is it not the mining industry's responsibility to come back to the table and commit themselves to addressing these issues that you highlight as important to facilitate this process and ensure that the claimants who rightly deserve those claims are actually receiving it at the end of the day? That's what I want to say.
So, Mohammed, for me personally, I do think that the companies have a responsibility to do more, which is why I've raised the problems about data gaps and so on. I can't speak for the wrangling that has gone on in settlements. You saw where I started, that I don't think that trusts are a solution to the historical problems that we have, or a solution to gaps in policy and regulation. They cannot be. And so I would also just, for me, at the moment, we can't change the recipe, but we can damn well do the best we can and raise the issues that ought to be raised. And I think that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Mo, for asking that question, and May for handling it. I think Jim also weighed in on that one as well. I've got my own slightly separate question. How do these trusts interact maybe with potential trusts beyond the borders of South Africa who are facing, because gold mining is something that is extensively done in Africa. And South Africa is probably light years ahead of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa as far as the development of trusts, seeking recourse in terms of past actions, even the record keeping, etc. Is there a kind of mentoring that exists between these trusts and potential trusts, so that even in the solution of the problem, it doesn't become a South African solution, but it becomes an African solution?
So Kedwin, I think firstly just to say that the other trusts have been incredibly helpful to the Tshiamiso Trust. We have been very grateful for the advice and the insights that we've obtained from those trusts and the individuals who continue to work into them. So yes, we're very grateful too that we have a Quebec trustee serving on the board of the Tshiamiso Trust as well. So we have a direct line into the learnings that have been made over the years. Then in terms of the reach of this trust, the interesting thing about sort of cross-border work is that as we have found out the hard way, that one has to go through really officialdom to get across the border. You can't just set up shop and work with organizations that are NGOs without going through a great deal of formality. These are sovereign countries. We wouldn't do the same in South Africa, is to allow companies to set up shop, or organizations to set up shop and start medical processes and so on without a great deal of scrutiny. So we face the same when we cross the borders. So in some instances, it's been easier to get going than others, but this involves a great deal of diplomacy and a great deal of creating understanding between the experts who exist in those countries and who do this kind of work in those companies, so we can create the space. So that's another aspect of complexity which I did not touch on.
Thank you, May. Any other questions that I might have missed? Or any other contributions? My other question, I think Sam probably touched on it, because I was just wondering, how much does it really cost to process, let's say, 10,000 Rand worth of a payment? What is the actual cost? So the claimant ends up with 10,000 Rand.
So I think what we will do, at the moment the cost is covered in the trust administrative budget. As I say, we have what we think is still a very small sample of data on the processing costs, and we will certainly make that available. At the moment, the information that's available on the trust website is quite comprehensive, but we will start producing those indicators ourselves, because they're going to be critical indicators for ensuring that the trust can reach and service everyone that it ought to.
Okay, thank you, May. Any other questions or any other hands that I've missed? If there are none, thank you very much. If there are any other questions that you want May to tackle, you can send them through via email and I'll forward them to her. And thank you once again, May, for making such a a great presentation and making time for it to join us here. And thank you to everyone who managed to join us. Let's meet again. And May, I know we'll keep on chatting because we have some things that we need to catch up on.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much, everybody, for your involvement in this discussion. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.